Good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to give a couple more minutes for people to join us before we get started. For those of you just joining us, we're going to give a couple more minutes and then we'll get started. All right, so I'm sure other people will trickle in as we get started here. But my name is Haley Troy. I'm a research coordinator here at the Center for mHealth and Social Media. And I'm honored today to introduce Dr. Eileen Carter. Dr. Carter is an assistant professor at the University of Connecticut School of Nursing. She's a health services researcher who is passionate about the use of patient-facing digital interventions to improve the uptake of research evidence and has received competitive extramural grant funding to support her research pertaining to the judicious use of antibiotics and infection prevention. Carter will share lessons she's learned in submitting her recent first K award, including how she found mentors at a new institution, how long it took to prepare, what roadblocks she ran into, and how she solved them. So thank you for joining us this afternoon. I will now turn things over to Dr. Carter.
Great. Thanks, Haley. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. It's a pleasure to be with you today and to share the lessons that I learned while submitting my first K or training grant award. So here's an outline of how we'll spend our time together. I'll first speak a bit about why I pursued a K, just to give some context into my background and situation. I'll then go into what I think I did well, what I wish I did differently. I'll speak about my next steps, and then we'll end a good amount of time for question and answer and open discussion. And certainly, I recognize that everyone's situation is quite different. My hope is that you'll be able to take away one or two, but hopefully more, practical tips from this presentation that will help you successfully submit your K proposal. So, my journey and why I pursued a training grant. So I'm an emergency nurse by background. After working for I'm sorry, I'm hearing an echo. If I could ask everybody if you could please mute your lines. The presentation will probably take, maybe 30 minutes or so, or 30 to 40 minutes. And then, we'll have, open discussion and Q&A. Thank you. So I'm an emergency department nurse by background. After working for several years in 2 academic emergency departments, I decided to pursue a PhD in nursing. Upon completing my PhD, I entered a non-traditional role and did not pursue postdoctoral training. And while I had accumulated a successful publication record, it became more and more clear to me over time that I lacked the skills and training to do what I wanted to do. And specifically, that is to implementation of evidence-based practices in real-world settings. And so in fall of 2020, I transitioned to a tenure-track faculty position here at the University of Connecticut School of Nursing. While I was personally motivated to pursue a K to gain the additional skills and training I believed I needed, I had heard from several others that Ks could be somewhat of a torturous exercise, with people saying things like, Ks are the hardest grants to write. And that's because you're essentially writing two grants, one about yourself and the other about the proposed research study. And so before embarking on the K, I really wanted to set myself up for success. I didn't want the development of the K to be an unbearable exercise. And I knew that my personal motivation to write the K was likely insufficient to get the job well done. And so I spoke with leadership at my school to establish their institutional support for the training grant. I knew that there were different schools of thought regarding the K, in which some institutions might prefer or encourage R submissions rather than Ks. Very fortunately for me, this was not the case. And so when seeking institutional support, important things to consider include support during the development of the K proposal, as well as during the K award period. As you'll see in the upcoming slides, the K application took a great amount of time and effort. It's important to think about when will you be working on the proposal? Is it the expectation that you're working on the application during the nights, evenings, between teaching courses? Or might you have teaching relief to work on the submission? Similarly, Ks can be several years long. If your application is successfully funded, you want to make sure that you have the 75% of protected time or so to concentrate on your research over the course of the award period. Okay, and so for me, I was highly motivated to pursue a K and fortunately had the institutional support for the K. But I knew I had limited skills in preparing a K as I had never done so before. And so to improve my skill set with K grant writing, I sought a local career development award program. Here locally at the Connecticut Convergence Institute for Translation and Regenerative Engineering, which was part of UConn Health, I applied for the Pre-K Scholar Career Development Award program. It's a 2-year interactive program that includes didactic training, protected time, and it's cohort-based. I was very fortunate to have been accepted into the program, which has been instrumental in keeping K writing at my forefront, having the instruction of highly successful senior faculty, and a social support system consisting of junior faculty like me who are on the same K writing and submission journey. So now that I had the groundwork in place, specifically institutional support for my K, including the support of my dean and the Career Development Program, or K program, I set out to find mentors at my new institution. Again, though, I started in my faculty role in fall of 2020, in which nearly all activities were remote due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so in trying to find mentors at my new institution, I kept reflecting on these two questions. First, how do I find the right mentors and collaborators in a new institution? And secondly, how do I build these relationships in the remote environment? So when looking for mentors, it's first critical to know, what exactly are you looking for? What specifically are you looking for in terms of mentorship and why? For me, I was seeking mentors with expertise in health outcomes research, intervention development, and clinical trials. So ideally, the mentor's expertise should advance your proposed research, your training plan, and your career goals. Other important things to consider, particularly for primary mentors, is that reviewers are going to evaluate your primary mentors, particularly your primary mentors, funding and mentorship records. So does your primary mentor have a successful track record of federal grant funding? And also, have they mentored other junior faculty with Ks? So for me, the biggest keys to finding mentors at my new institution were asking for recommendations and following up. Specifically, I sought mechanisms locally that supported research development. I spent a tremendous amount of time searching online. So here at UConn, I found that they have the Institute for Collaboration on Health Intervention and Policy, or INCHIP. Here on the right of your screen, you can see that INCHIP supports research development and specifically the development of research teams. I reached out to INCHIP, discussed my research interests, and key personnel of INCHIP referred me to a highly successful senior researcher who I then contacted and who willingly served as my mentor. Another one of my mentors I identified by seeking opportunities to talk about my research. Here locally, we have routine grant preparatory meetings. During one of these meetings, I presented on my planned grant submission. A faculty member recommended that I reach out to another highly successful senior researcher, who I then contacted, and again, who graciously agreed to serve as my mentor. I will say, though, that the process of finding mentors took a lot of time and effort. For time purposes, I'm merely just giving the highlights. I can't tell you how many hours I spent exploring institutional faculty pages, research centers, PubMed, and NIH Reporter to find exceptional mentors. And as you already know, much about successful mentorship is about fit. I found it helpful to ask other mentees how they found working with the identified senior faculty members to get a sense of whether our personalities and work styles might mesh well. And so, how did I build these relationships with my mentors at my new institution? Because there were no in-person meetings, all initial communication was via email. I recall in the initial email, I really wanted to clearly convey my potential, my intention, and my ask. And so in my initial email, I gave a bit of an introduction about me, my research and training goals, and how my research and training goals aligns with their expertise. In this email, I also included my bio sketch, draft specific aims page, and I also asked to meet with them remotely. So after I identified my mentorship team, I continued to engage with my mentors over the course of developing the application and of course to date. For me, their mentorship is not just about the K. I'm committed to conducting the proposed study and gaining additional skills and training to support me in my professional goals. As I worked on the application, I continued to engage with my mentors regarding my progress and to seek their guidance. It was important for me to not fall off the rails, go off the rails with the proposal, and to leverage their expertise. So our mentor-mentee relationships, they've become much more of a partnership. And it's not just about me asking for their help. It's important to ask your mentors, how can you help them on their research while building your own skill set? For instance, are there standing meetings that you can join to become more active and participate in your work? Or is there, a paper that potentially you can contribute to? Okay, so now that you know a bit about my journey, what do I think I did well? We've covered a bit of this in the previous slides. First, what worked for me is that I started the process early with institutional support of my dean, being part of a structured career development program. I know that I tend to get overwhelmed and anxious if I procrastinate. So for me, it was key to start the application early. As you can see in this slide, I started the process about 10 months before the application was due. I recognized I was building a new mentorship team. There was much I didn't know, and I anticipated that the proposal would undergo several iterations that were beyond my, beyond what I could envision. Also, as seen here in December, I obtained funded examples of my K mechanism. We'll get to in the next slide. But here for this slide, these are just kind of some highlights that talk a bit about my timeline, what I actually did. And to say that all of this was intentional would be, incorrect. Okay, so NIH Reporter is a wonderful search tool. I would certainly encourage you to take time to browse for mentors, for success rates, and which we'll get into. But you can also use NIH Reporter to find funded Ks in your mechanism. So it was recommended to me that I find funded proposals in my mechanism to use as a reference when writing my K. So I took a chance and reached out to a few of the names with recent training grants that responded to the same program announcement. I was delighted that many of those who I reached out to actually responded to my email, but not only did they respond to my email, but they also commonly included their research strategy or even their training plans. Now, I know that you can also gain this information using the Freedom of Information Act, but I thought it was so incredibly gracious, for these junior faculty members to share their funded proposals with me. And I must say, throughout the K process, one thing that has been very clear to me is that people are willing to help, but you have to be vulnerable enough to ask for the help. So the NIH also includes success rates for training and research career development programs on its website. I've included the link here, but you can also simply find it just by doing a Google search and using, NIH success rates in the search bar. So when you come to the website, click the heading Training and Research Career Development Programs. You can see it down here, on the very bottom of the screenshot. You'll then see an Excel file that appears, and it's entitled Career Development Award Ks, Competing Applications, Awards, Success Rates, and Funding by Activity Code and Institute Center. Download that file. I've included a picture here of this Excel file that's available for download. As seen on the image on the right, a wealth of information from fiscal years 2011 to 2020 is available. And so you can filter by fiscal year, activity code, NIH Institute or Center to see the number of applications reviewed, the number of applications awarded, success rates, and total funding for that fiscal year. So I found this information very helpful in helping me to narrow down and find the right activity and institute center for the K. Another thing that I think I did well was that I engaged my program officer early. I first met with my program officer about 8 months before I submitted the grant. In preparing for our meeting, I sent my specific aims page and bio sketch. My big question for the meeting was, is my application a good fit here? So my program officer provided very helpful feedback, including emphasizing the need for patient-oriented outcomes and addressing my questions regarding my eligibility for the award. Also, when speaking with the PO and when writing the grant, I knew it was also important to clearly articulate how the proposed study aligns with the mission, vision, and research priorities of the agency. So the last thing that I want to share that I think I did well, and this is probably the most important thing that I found, is that I was flexible in my approach and thinking. I embraced critiques. I often asked for feedback and was responsive to that feedback. So this included feedback from my program officer, my mentors, and reviewers' comments from my mock review, which we'll talk about in a few slides. So over the course of the application, I encountered several roadblocks, including, my initial proposal had somewhat of a different focus and was to be conducted in the hospital setting. With all that was happening with COVID, it was clear that this proposal just was not feasible. And another aspect was around the need to prioritize patient outcomes, as was emphasized by my program officer. So being nimble was key to navigating these roadblocks. It was also essential that I had the time to thoughtfully make these changes to the proposal to address these challenges. All right. And so while there were some things that I did well, there were several things that I certainly wish that I did differently, especially when reflecting on my process. All right. A big part of the K is about you. Who are you professionally? Where do you want to go? How has your past experiences shaped this vision? How are you going to get there? For me, this was the hardest part of the application. I just had a hard time writing about me for whatever reason, and it was much easier for me to write about the research. If you can have a mock review, I strongly encourage it. It's called a mock review because it simulates a real study section in which reviewers discuss and score your application according to the specified criteria and create a summary of your proposal's strengths and limitations. So highlighted in my mock review was the need for me to explicitly address why did I need this additional research training. So in hindsight, I wish that I had worked backwards and started with my end in mind. Specifically, what are my career goals and how will the proposed research and my training plan help me to achieve these career goals? I also wish I was better organized and had a set schedule for document completion. There are so many documents. I think my submitted application was about 125 pages in length. And many of these documents took much longer than I anticipated. So for instance, I recall the clinical trials document, and certainly human subjects. Those took a lot longer than I thought. I wish I set deadlines for the completion of these documents so I didn't feel like I was struggling a bit towards the end. Similarly, in hindsight, I wish that I had prioritized authoring a manuscript of preliminary work with my mentors. And this would provide evidence of a successful mentor-mentee relationship. Yet my principal focus was doing the preliminary work and including a narrative summary of the findings from the preliminary work in my proposal. But certainly it would have been helpful if I had disseminated the work as a conference abstract in time for my grant submission. Okay. I also wished I had read potential program announcements more closely. So to find program announcements, go to this website here. I've included the URL. And then click Career Development up here on the horizontal bar. So when you select Career Development, you'll scroll below and then you'll see program announcements of all Research Career Development Awards. And I included a snapshot of some of those here. So certainly I looked at these awards to find the appropriate mechanisms, including, did I fit the eligibility requirements of the mechanism? Was my research a particular fit with the funding agency? But I wish I paid extra attention to details. So when you click on a specific mechanism, so for instance, shown here is the parent KO1 where a clinical trial is required, you'll see a special note that appears. And it's right here. It is in bold, but program announcements can be quite lengthy. And so for whatever reason, I just kind of glossed over on that. Well, the special note reads, not all NIH institutes and centers participate in parent announcements. Applicants should carefully note which ICs participate in this announcement and view their respective areas of research interests and requirements at the table of IC specific information, requirements, and staff contacts website. So, needless to say, I failed to review this table that has an embedded hyperlink, which resulted in me spending a good amount of time pursuing a mechanism and institute that wasn't a great fit. So when you click on the hyperlink table, again, that's table IC, which was referenced in the previous slide, you'll see institute-specific information according to the program announcement. And it includes salary support and fringe, research support, scope of the work, and in some cases, even limits to the length of the award. So I would definitely encourage you to read the institute or center-specific information of your program announcement to ensure that you're aware of really important foundational information up front. Okay, so we're going to transition now to my next steps. So in terms of my next steps, my K application received a solid score and the critiques were incredibly helpful. Fortunately, very fortunately, no fatal flaw was identified by reviewers. I'm also thankful that reviewers suggested remedies to address some of the areas of weaknesses they identified. So for instance, one of the suggestions was, the applicant proposes to audit X course. It's recommended that she take it formally instead. So in terms of my process with the summary statement, I shared the summary statement with my mentors and we reviewed the feedback together. I then scheduled a meeting with my program officer to discuss the few items that were unclear in the summary statement and to discuss whether my proposal might be eligible for funding this time around, as it was my understanding that it was somewhat on the cusp. But because my score is not in the fundable range, I'm proceeding to work on the resubmission. So what is my plan of attack for the resubmission? Because my summary statements were quite lengthy and detailed. So my plan of attack is that first, I'm creating a verbatim list of all of the weaknesses that were identified by reviewers. Because what you want to make sure in your resubmission, my understanding, is that you certainly want to be responsive to the weaknesses that reviewers identified. So first, I'm going to have a verbatim list of all of the weaknesses that they identified, and then I'm going to group the weaknesses thematically. I'm going to then engage my mentors to address those concerns, write up my one-page response, and then update my proposal for resubmission. And hopefully I'll be resubmitting that in just a couple of months in this March. So in summary, I have some overarching takeaways from the process of my first case submission. First, preparing the application took a lot longer than I thought. It took me a solid 10 months to prepare the application. It was certainly a labor of love and went through multiple iterations. Second, much of the K is a story about you. It's important to think with the end in mind. What are your career goals? What past experiences informed your career goals and why? How does the proposed research build upon your previous work and advance your career goals? What is your training plan, and how does the plan advance your career goals? Also, the K relied on the expertise of many who graciously provided their expertise along the way. I did not have previous relationships with any of my K mentors. They graciously agreed to serve as my mentor, and I engaged them along the way to think things through. So looking back at my journey, it was characterized by several important turns resulting from the feedback of others, including my mentors, my program officer, and the comments of reviewers from my mock review. Again, I strongly encourage you to take advantage of a mock review if you have the opportunity to do so. The feedback that I gained, it certainly served to build some of the skills I'm seeking as part of the K, has helped to clarify my thinking and resulted in a much, much stronger product. I would encourage you to keep your mentors engaged throughout the grant writing process. Remember, they have the expertise you need, and they've graciously agreed to serve as your mentor. So with that, I'll now open the floor to some discussion and questions and answers. This presentation was really just the very, very highlights. As I mentioned, I had been working on this for 10 months before the submission. And I know that it is a tremendous, tremendous undertaking. I think when I think about what I have done professionally, I would say that this was probably one of the hardest things that I've done. But certainly looking back, I've grown tremendously as a result of the process. So I would be happy to take any and all questions. And I hope that you found some of the presentation helpful. And thank you again for joining me today and for your time.
Folks are now able to unmute themselves.
So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen because I think that there might be some questions in the chat and I can't see the questions very well when I'm sharing. So let me just stop sharing.
Hi, Eileen. This is Margaret Lloyd-Seeger. Really awesome presentation. Thank you so much. I'm in the School of Social Work at UConn. I am sort of confused by, or would love to hear your experience with the number of mentors, like how you picked the number of mentors you included, if you identified collaborators or consultants, and then how many, like what percentage were at UConn versus at other institutions? If you could just talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, excellent questions. And let me just first preface this by saying, that what I'm merely sharing is my journey. I don't know if this is the correct one. This is things that I have heard, but I'm not an expert with the K. But I can share in terms of mentors. What I had heard is you don't want a huge mentorship team that there's just too many cooks in the kitchen and you're not quite sure, who is really doing what. So I think what's key with the mentorship team, and I've also seen in program announcements to say, that they recommend to have a team of mentors, albeit with one in particular serving as your primary mentor. So for me, what was very helpful is kind of having a grid to say, and it helped me clarify my thinking and to share with my mentors to say, here's what I need from you. Here's the expertise that I'm seeking elsewhere. So for instance, if you're saying, my expertise, I'm looking for expertise in health outcomes research, that corresponds to aim 1, and that's mapping to this mentor, as opposed to aim 2 is looking at expertise in Y, and that maps to the expertise of so and so. So I think having the responsibilities very, very clearly delineated is very helpful for writing the grant, but also communicating that with your mentors. In terms of mentors from inside the institution versus outside, for me, I was new to UConn while first writing this application. And so I felt as though there were a lot of, I just didn't have previous relationships with my mentors. And so I felt like I really needed to establish those relationships internally before seeking out expertise externally. However, if there were, people from outside the institution that I had somewhat had a bit of a relationship with, I think I might feel differently and say, would you be willing to serve as my mentor? Um, but that was one of the feedbacks that I received from reviewers' comments is, you know, one identified weakness, and it wasn't a huge weakness, but it was, demonstrate that you have a successful mentor-mentee relationship. And so that was kind of where one of my comments came in. I wish that I had, had some sort of publication with them or some sort of, abstract proceeding accepted.
Thank you.
Of course.
Hi, Dr. Carter. This is Sadiqa Mulchin. I am a clinical faculty member at UConn, but I actually am primarily at Connecticut Children's. I'm a clinical psychologist in our Center for Cancer and Blood Disorders. Thanks so much for sharing your journey. Just as a quick follow-up to the previous question, in terms of who you selected as your primary mentor, did they also have a similar background as you? You mentioned having a background in nursing, for example. Right now, I sort of have a team that's one's a psychologist, one's a psychiatrist, and one is a physician. So we're trying to figure out how to determine primary mentorship. And I was curious if that played a role in your experience. Thank you in advance.
Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah. So for me, my primary mentor does not have a background as a nurse. That was certainly something that I had certainly, thought about. But I ended up pursuing the KO8 mechanism through the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, or AHRQ. And so that was certainly something that I had discussed with my program officer, and it was not an issue. So I think that that's a really important consideration and it might be, helpful to talk with your program officer to see whether or not, the institute or center feels strongly about, being mentored or the primary mentor being with the same kind of background and training. I'll look now in the chat box. I think I see some things.
Hi, Dr. Carter. If I can just
Yeah, definitely.
first off, thank you for sharing. Everything's fantastic. But a quick question I have is, I think one of the less discussed components of any K grant is the actual transition to independence. So people will talk about the training plan and the mentorship plan and the research plan, but no one actually talks about that last critical component, which is what are you going to do when you get independent before you need to get there. Would you mind just sharing a little bit of your insight as to how your total application was kind of colored by that specific aspect of how are you going to get independent and what are you going to do once you are?
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, so I had a specific training goal that's all about kind of professional development that would help me, in that transition phase. And also, within my application, I said, this findings from this aim, from I think it was aim 3, is going to be foundational to my subsequent or my planned R01, which I plan to write in years X of the training grant. And I think key to that also is, for my mentors in their letter, what they had highlighted is that they have also, mentored junior faculty on Ks and helped them as they transitioned from, from their K to an independent, scientist. So I think all of those things, really help to, help to show that you will be supported in that transition.
Okay.
That's the question.
Yeah, that's a huge help. Thank you.
So just, I see a question, I think, how many mentors did you include? What about consultants, collaborators? Were they all at UConn? So I did something a little bit differently. I had I had a mentorship team that consisted of 2 mentors for the resubmission. I think I'm going to include. I think that is going to increase in number upon the suggestions of the reviewers. In addition to my mentors, I also had an external kind of advisory board that consists of patients and clinicians. And so it was kind of this kind of multifaceted kind of mentorship team. Is the pre-K, I'm reading Veronica's question, is the pre-K award something that is unique to your organization? So the pre-K, it is unique. The specific pre-K program is unique to UConn. However, I do know that there's, other career development award programs at other academic institutions that will help kind of, that are structured somewhat similarly, that help you go through this process. And I will say that, this is a tremendous undertaking to write a K. And it can be isolating. And so I think having that kind of social support is very, very helpful. So it's not to say that, you have to be part of a program, but I would say, if you have another colleague who's going through the same process, I think it would be very, very helpful to kind of establish some sort of, support system. Because it can be, as all academic work, it can be challenging and isolating, particularly in the remote environment. So I've got a question. Can you comment on choosing between the different types of Ks, specifically K99 ROO? So this gets at a lot of, eligibility and focus. So for me, I thought what was really important for me is kind of my clinical background as a nurse, focus in health services research, focus on kind of implementation science, evidence-based practice, and then I kind of gravitated towards AHRQ. In terms of the K99 RRO, I really didn't give it much consideration because I didn't meet eligibility criteria. My understanding is for that specific mechanism, you have to be a certain amount of time after your postdoc. You have to have been in a postdoc, which I never had. So I think, really paying close attention to the mechanism and the eligibility is really important for deciding the specific mechanism that's right for you. In terms of the presentation, can I share it? Yeah, I'd be happy to share it. I know that the link to the presentation will be made available on the mHealth website of UConn. And I can also ask if we could just post the slides as well, because I do know that there's some embedded hyperlinks that you might find helpful. Yeah, so also another question about the ROO. So what I submitted was a K08. It did not include an ROO phase. Please feel free to chime in and ask any questions if you have any.
So Eileen, thank you so much for sharing your experience and all of this information. So I know you mentioned that you spent 10 months preparing. Can you share what percentage of your time, I know you were a brand new junior faculty while you were doing most of this, so what percentage of your time were you actually devoting over that 10-month time period to this application? Thank you.
Yeah, excellent question. So as part of the pre-K award program, they do support 30% of your time to dedicate specifically towards writing the K, and which was incredible. But in the absence of that, I think it's really important, or even in addition to that, speaking with your dean, speaking to the support at your school, at your university, to say, can I have some protected relief time to work on this application? It's tremendous. Again, the application, consisted of, about 125 pages. There are so many different components. Really has to be a cohesive story. So I think having that protected time is really, really essential. It's not just having the protected time when you get the award, really about how are you preparing for the award. So I've got a question about how far into the work are you, and have you had found the need to make changes? If so, what is the process? Yeah, so for my so I submitted the grant in June of last year, and so received the summary statements, and now I'm working on the revision, which I hope to submit in March. So in terms of my process for the revisions is, I've got a pretty lengthy summary statement. While the reviewers did not identify any fatal flaws, thankfully, they did identify several minor to moderate weaknesses. And many of them did overlap, which is quite nice. But I've got a double screen here. So on one screen, I've got my summary statement, and then I'm literally dragging and dropping that into a Word document to make sure that I, itemize all of them. I'm then going to collate them thematically, so I kind of know what are the big kind of ticket items that I need to be working on. And then engaging my reviewers to kind of work through those revisions, and then creating my, one-page summary, and then, plugging away on the resubmission. Okay, I've got a question submitted prior to the talk. So when deciding which institution to submit your K, are you better off choosing perhaps a more competitive institution with better funding, even though the odds of being accepted are less likely to get more targeted feedback for future studies? For example, as a nurse, I have been encouraged to submit a K99 ROO to NINR, but my research is interdisciplinary and fits within NCI-funded research. So I would call the PO at NCI. I mean, email them, set up a meeting, see whether or not if it's a good fit at NCI. And also, I would look at the success rates for different institutes. I know that NINR and NCI have different success rates for their training grant applications. I don't know if it differs dramatically for K99s and ROOs. But I kind of thought broadly when I first kind of looked at institutes, and just kind of played in the dirt a little bit. Contact the program officers; they're there to help you. And it's they'll tell you. I remember when I was submitting my NRSA, for my pre-doc, I reached out to the program officer, and the feedback, it was really kind of startling and upsetting, to be honest. Kind of depressing. But he said to me flat out, he said, why are you submitting this here? We're not interested. And it was a really difficult pill to swallow, but it's great to know, they're not interested. Let's look elsewhere. But I would, and I would say, the success rates for Ks are much better than the success rates for Rs. So, I would say, don't think of it as, that, what you're trying to do is get feedback. You're going to get a summary statement regardless. it might be discussed, it might not be discussed, but I would go for the funding agency that you think, you're, that you're positioned best to get funding, not to get reviews. So, in terms of 10 months preparing, I'll say that that is when I formally started the writing. But in terms of my thinking, it started before 10 months. And even my little Google searches. I can't imagine the ridiculous things that I put into that Google search bar to kind of try to find mentors at my new institution. But I would say, that the thinking kind of process started before 10 months. Actual writing started 10 months.
Dr. Carter, sorry, it's Sadiqa again. I was just curious about the mock review and how you kind of organize that. Is that something that is something that you just did, or is that something readily available? I'm sorry if others are familiar with it. That was very new to me. So I'd love to know more about that if you could share.
Yeah, excellent question. I would so that was done through the pre-K award program. However, there are, many different schools at UConn, and even if they might not have a formal mock review, process, you could request one. And I would imagine, that people would be, especially if there are seasoned investigators, it might not go through kind of this formal process, while you're there and you're kind of listening to them. But I would imagine that people, if you've got seasoned investigators within your, within your school, your institution, your university, that they would provide you with very, very detailed feedback. And that's exactly what it is. It's people that have very, very fresh eyes. They've never seen your proposal. And they're looking at it as if they are a reviewer from, a study section. And so they're looking at, what's the significance? They're scoring it according to, significance, innovation, the research strategy, the career development award. And that was so incredible to me to say, hey, you've really got to focus in on this section here, or these components are really, really not clear. And sometimes it's just a matter of, you've got the information somewhere in the proposal, but it's just about kind of making it easier for the reader. But I would definitely encourage the mock review. And also when I had and you want to also make sure you try to have the mock review 2 to 3 months out from your submission to allow you time to revise accordingly. So for instance, in my mock review, one of the big things was, explicitly tell me why you need this career development award. And the other thing was around, well, if you want expertise in clinical trials, why aren't you doing a clinical trial? And so and it made total sense to me, total sense. But it was, you just don't know what you don't know, and you're so close to it, it's hard to kind of take a step back. And so from that feedback, I rewrote kind of my background, my candidate background section, and I also incorporated a new aim. So you want to make sure that you have enough sufficient time and bandwidth to really be responsive to the mock reviewer's comments in your actual submission. Oh, awesome. Thank you, Dr. Perry. I'm seeing a question about, about the NINR and the K99 ROO. Dr. Perry's offering to provide guidance there. Thank you. I have no idea about that mechanism.
You're welcome. I can help anyone with the K99. It's also a bear, so.
Oh, and thank you, Caitlin. I see UConn School of Medicine also offers mock study sections. It's fantastic. A big thing with the study section, and I wish that I did this with the mock review, get it in the best shape that you can. The best. I remember it was, encouraged, I think, that I had the human subjects, and I was like, it's encouraged, I'm not going to do it. And then I just kind of put it off. Human subjects, that took forever long for me. There's just so many different components, and you want to make sure that there's consistency in what you're saying in the human subjects document and what you're saying in the research strategy and whatnot. So I went through the questions. I'm not sure if there's any I missed. If I did, please let me know.
Yeah, we should have time for about one more question if anyone has anything lingering currently.
No one has a question. I just wanted to say thank you. I mean, it's Anne-Marie Morides, and it was just so nice to have your honesty and really give us a sense of the process, and the slides were so helpful. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm so glad that you found them helpful, and I'm glad that we had enough time for questions and answers. I did have I included my email. Please feel free to reach out if you have any additional kind of questions, or if you just wanted to chat about the process. Again, I'm not an expert in this area, just sharing with you kind of the things that I've learned along the way.
Well, thank you, Dr. Carter, for taking the time this afternoon to share your experience with all of us. And thank you all for joining in and having such great questions to ask. Yeah.